Hello and welcome to tonight's Festival of Ideas event, How to Be Multiple, the Philosophy of Twins. I'm Kate Giles and I'm your host for this evening, and I am delighted to welcome Helena de Bres, who's with us this evening to talk about her amazing book. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Helena to you. Helena is a professor of philosophy at Wellesley College in the States, where she researches and teaches ethics, the philosophy of literature, and political theory. Her essays and humour writing have appeared in The Point, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, McSweeney's Internet Tendency, and elsewhere. And her book, Artful Truths, The Philosophy of Memoir, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2021. So Helena, very warm welcome from across the pond. And I hope the time difference isn't too confusing for you.
Not at all. Thank you so much for having me, Kate. It's really wonderful to be here.
Well, thank you so much. I feel really privileged that I was sent an advanced copy of your book, which is now out happily in the UK as well as in the States. And I just wondered if we could start our conversation this evening, and we're going to talk for about 40 minutes and then hand over for questions to the audience. Whether you could just tell me a little bit about your academic specialisms generally and what you were working on before you came to the book about twins.
Absolutely, yeah. So for a few years now, I've been writing on the philosophy of memoir. So a bunch of ethical and metaphysical questions about the writing of personal narrative. It's a theoretical book about memoir, and this book is a nice follow-on from that because it is a memoir of sorts, but obviously includes a lot of philosophy too. So I set up the project, I guess, with that more academic work first.
Yeah. So in terms of what led you to write this book, some of our viewers might guess that being a twin might have had something to do with the choice of the title. But I guess before we get on to the twin thing, I wondered whether you could say what prompted you to write this book now, or at least, in the run up to its publication. What were those particular circumstances?
Yeah, well, there was a personal, immediate personal motivation alongside the long-standing identity as a twin, which was it was during the pandemic. I was in California working on my other book. I just wrapped that up. I wanted a new project. Had nothing to do. We're all stuck at home, and also it was obviously a very distressing time. I was thinking a lot about my sister, who lives in New Zealand. I was very far away from her, and so I wanted a project that would allow me to collaborate with her, essentially go back to this happy time we had when we were kids and would often work on projects together. My sister's an illustrator, so she's done several illustrations for the book. And also she helped me a lot while I was writing about it, writing the book, with the ideas, with remembering things that I'd forgotten. She has a better memory than me. So partly it was just a way to do something that felt positive and valuable and connected with her during that difficult time.
Well, it definitely feels like she is a very strong presence in the book as well. So I wonder, could you tell us a little bit about Julia? She's such a character in this book.
Yes, everyone's always telling me she's their favorite character in the book, which I should be offended by, but she's also my favorite character. She's a wonderful person. We may talk about this later, but we have one of those classic twin divisions where one twin is the introvert, one's the extrovert. So she tends to be more bubbly and sociable than I am. We're both professors, so we have a lot to talk about intellectually. We have a lot of fun together. She's an amazing person. She's my favorite person in so many ways.
That's great. So the fact that you're both academics, I think we will come on to that later, but that must have been a real help where there's something particular about framing and writing a book that other academics kind of get. So it's amazing to have that support as you're in the middle of that endeavor.
Yes, I mean, there's a secret here you haven't revealed yet, Kate, but Kate also is a twin who has a professor twin. So speaking from experience there.
I think that might have been one of the reasons I was asked to chair this evening. I totally enjoyed the book, and there were so many moments in it where it's very interesting to see those moments of revelation, another kind of mirror held up to your own experience. So we'll come back to that, I think. so I want to sort of work our way through the book because there's such a profound thread throughout the book. And you lead us in very nicely at the start of the book by thinking about images of twins from popular culture and literature and art. And you might want to talk about some of those, but I love the fact that you talk about what your favorite image is, and that is of Tweedledee and Tweedledum in Alice Through the Looking Glass. I wonder if you could just tell us about that image and why that's so profound for you.
Yeah, I love that picture. I think the original picture by John Tenniel, and many people I think could probably summon it mentally or Google it. So it's Alice coming across Tweedledum and Tweedledee in the woods. They're partly shadowed in darkness, which I think is significant because there is a dark quality to twinhood that we might get into later on. But they're standing very closely next to each other. They've got a side hug going on. They're clearly very affectionate. And they look very alike. You know, the first thing that most people think about when they think about twins is physical similarity. So these two are lined up. They're actually mirror images. The illustrator did this very subtle difference in them, so they actually correspond sort of left to right. So there's sort of secret little clues in there. They're performing for Alice in that scene. They're performing a poem for her. So they're doing this thing that twins often do, which is to kind of ham up their own twinhood. So in this one picture, we have the closeness, we have the physical similarity, we have the darker side of twinhood sort of lurking in the background, and then we have this performative quality. So there's just so much in that picture that captures what my own experience of being a twin was like growing up.
So that sort of united front, they've got each other in that sort of embrace, but that doesn't mean to say that there aren't tensions bubbling underneath as the story unfolds. And is it a cricket bat at their feet?
It's an umbrella. Yeah,
umbrella, that's right.
I forget which one ends up hitting the other one with this umbrella, you know, so you see there's some foreshadowing of some more complicated feelings.
You use that in the book to lead us into thinking about your first chapter is, I suppose it's the question that all of us have been asked as twins, which one are you? And you use that to talk about the way that twins tend to assume that, or that non-twins tend to assume that twins are binary opposites, introvert versus extrovert, you've mentioned already. And I think it's really interesting in the book that you're both challenging that, but also being very honest about your own experience of that with Julia. So I wonder, could you unpack that sort of tension for us a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. There is this, you might say, twin way of presenting twins. On the one hand, we often like to think of them as being very, very similar. And then there's this polar opposite way of representing them in everyday life and also in art and popular culture as being these binary opposites. So the good twin versus the evil twin it's very common trope across, you know, many different cultures and genres. So we do tend to think that there's a relatively simplistic binary and one twin can be located on either end of it. So it's frustrating growing up to have that kind of thinking imposed on you, but I think it's also useful in certain ways. So what I wanted to do in that chapter is talk about the ways that binary thinking can actually be beneficial for us. Partly as a way just to understand, why do we do it? Obviously, it can be really reductive and cramping. There are many ways in which it can be bad. Why is it also good? And I think the twins are a really useful illustration of the benefits of binary thinking in personal development, right? You're trying to work out who you are as a kid. And in order to do that, you need to work out who you're not. So it's handy to have an image of something else to contrast yourself with, so you can narrow in on your own sense of identity. And I think we all do that, not just twins. Singletons do it with their siblings or close friends, sometimes their parents. But twins do it in such a vivid way that they're a kind of test case for that particular tendency.
Yeah, I mean, I think many twins would sort of echo that experience, you know, who am I and who am I not? You go on to then reflect very, very interestingly about the ways in which perhaps as you leave home or as you make your own way in the world, you might find that changing, and how that might be surprising that you suddenly discover that you have elements of the thing that you thought you were not actually are allowed to come to the fore, or that you find those in yourself. And I wonder again if you could sort of say a little bit more about that in your experience and thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said before, I was framed as the introvert growing up, and in comparison to my sister, I definitely am the introvert. But what I noticed when I moved to the US for graduate school was the first time that we'd spent sustained time apart. Was that in relation to other people, I wasn't that introverted at all. I was actually relatively friendly and sociable. So I realized my positioning on the spectrum was very much determined by my relation to her, not to humanity at large. So my self-conception changed a little bit. I also just had more scope. I needed to be more sociable so that I could make friends rather than rely on Julia for that. So I had more space to expand and grow outside what I had seen myself to be in the past. So part of the reason the book is called How to Be Multiple is that I do think that, twins themselves need to learn to move beyond what might be a restrictive picture of who they are, but also thinking about how twins do that can help singletons, non-twins, think about the ways that their own selves might be more capacious and flexible than they've taught themselves or have had, taught to them.
Yes, I suppose that experience of leaving a familial environment in which even within sibling culture you can be pigeonholed as a certain thing and not others, but also then using that experience as you develop and you grow to say, I know what being a bit more of an extrovert looks like, or I know what I will say that I'm sure my twin Mel won't mind me saying that I was the tidy one and she was the messy one. And I was horrified when she went to university to hear from her housemates and her staff in residences that she was incredibly neat, and felt that I'd wasted 18 years clearing up after her. But it definitely, as when I read that in your book, I thought that absolutely is true. She discovered that she could clear up after herself after all. So I'm sure she wouldn't mind me saying that. I wonder at this point whether you could also say something about uh, identical versus fraternal twins, and how I appreciate that I can only experience what we've experienced, but there is a slight and subtle difference there that is not always talked about, but actually within twins themselves is often. I've been asked, are you a real twin or a fake twin? And it's an interesting tension, isn't it?
Yeah, there's definitely a status difference in twins. So I think in general, the culture tends to think that identical twins are the better twins or the realer twins. Of course, technically they're not. Everyone who's a twin is a twin. So identical twins are formed when a single egg splits after fertilization, and fraternal or non-identical twins are formed out of two separate eggs. So they're sometimes called siblings born at the same time. If someone's trying to demote them from twinhood, they have the same amount of shared genes as normal siblings do. But they grow up in step next to each other. They experience a lot of the sort of external pressures and attitudes that people give to twins in general. And they're often very close. Not every identical twin is super close to their twin. So I think we tend to sort of generalize and think that the identical kind just somehow have this magically tight bond and non-identical twins don't, but there's no real generalization to be made there. So I have that tendency too to think the identicals are somehow superior, and I've been working against it. I think part of what bothers me about the sort of headlining of identical twins is that it feels like it's driven by the priorities of singletons, right? It's fun and interesting to see people who look very similar, and singletons tend to emphasize that more superficial physical aspect of twinhood, whereas if you're a twin, what really matters is the relationship that you have, which doesn't have a whole lot to do with how you look on the surface.
No.
So I recognize the tendency in myself and I try and work against it.
Well, I'm sure maybe we'll have some twins in the audience who would like to kind of post their thoughts and their views, and I think that you mentioned that kind of capacious definition is also one where fraternal twins experiences are very distinctive, and it would be great to think a little bit more about that, perhaps from our audience as well. I mean, one of the things I love about the book is the way that you bring in so much social, cultural, and particularly obviously from your specialism, the philosophical thinking in a way that's really accessible and a gateway into thinking about the self. And in your second chapter, where you're thinking about twins and the philosophy of that. There's a wonderful quote, twins can be both a single person and distinct people without contradiction. And I thought that was a really profound reflection, especially in terms of concepts of the self, but also why that's so hard perhaps for non-twins to understand. Could you talk to us a little bit about that, the self and what that means in terms of this distinction, but also not the self?
Yeah, very much so. So this is a question that I've really evolved in my thinking about over the course of writing the book. Twins often get told, or it's implied, that twins somehow share personhood or selfhood. So they'll be given a single birthday present to share. They'll be called the twins, rather their own individual names aren't used. They'll be seen to sort of sub in for each other in various social settings as if they're interchangeable. And growing up, I often found that tendency irritating. And metaphysically, I just said, of course, I'm not the same person as my sister. We live in different countries. We have for a long time. We have quite distinct personalities. Our bodies are distinct. So I used to dismiss it. But I had this experience when I was visiting Julia a few years ago, where we were sitting in a library. We were working on projects with tight deadlines. So I was about to go to the bathroom, and I said to Julia, do you want me to go to the bathroom for you? And it just came out of my mouth. I just, obviously, I don't believe that I can go to the bathroom for my sister. But in that moment where I wasn't really attending, it's like this subconscious sensation or impression I had that I was somehow merged with her came to the fore. So that set off some thoughts about whether there was a way in which we were, that we shared personhood, obviously not in the standard way, but in a more extended way. So in the book, I talk about 3 different ways that I think twins can be seen to function as a single person. They can share each other's minds in a certain kind of way. They can share agency. They can share identity. And again, I think this is a particularly vivid instance of it. But if non-twins think about their own very close relationships, there are some analogs there too. And the reason I think this is important is that our culture, at least Western culture, is very committed to this image of the ideal life as being one that has sharp, distinct boundaries between individuals. The ideal person is supposed to really see themselves as a distinct agent physically, emotionally, in terms of agency. And it's somehow pathological or unhealthy to be too connected to another person. And I just wanted to push back on that idea a bit. I think that we can take it to extremes. Boundaries are important, but we also need to recognize that humans are social beings. And there's actually something beautiful about that when you think about it in the right way.
So that notion of, I mean, you also, there's quite a lot of ethnography in the book, which is really fascinating, about the perception of twins in different cultures, and where those boundaries are. And the relational self. You talk about some really interesting writers talking about the individual self or the relational self in really interesting ways to kind of problematize and question those kind of Western notions of the single in control of the self, and also that it's something that you should develop as you grow up. So you grow out of being a twin and you realize that that's the model you should be aspiring to.
Yeah, very much so. I think that when twins are young, people often find it very sweet when they seem to be merging in certain ways. It's very compelling seeing young twins acting jointly. But there's a sense that once you reach maybe teenagehood, it's time for you to start living like a normal life, right? Detaching, individuating. There's a lot of pressure for twins to go their separate ways. Which does, yeah, the impression is that you're supposed that being a twin is somehow a childish state that you need to mature out of. And I do think it puts a lot of pressure on twins. It's unhealthy in lots of ways. Some twins are not going to want to be super close or have their lives be very connected later on, and that's fine. I just don't think we should be imposing this vision universally across all twin dyads. I'd like us to have a more open and flexible and broad understanding of the kinds of relationships that are healthy.
Do you think that's threatening? Do you think that notion of the relational self, or we'll talk in a moment about kind of twins in relationships, but do you think the notion of that relational self is problematic for singletons or problematic for certain cultures and not for others?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there is obviously what I would assume is a relatively universal fear of being, dominated by or sort of somehow overwhelmed by another person. That makes sense. If it heads in that direction, that can be bad. But again, I think that Western culture has really emphasized that because of our whole history with liberal political theory, this idea of the individual self as being kind of sacrosanct. So I do think it's, don't generalize too much, but in many non-Western cultures, that idea of the self as being relational is the foundational view. And there's something pathological about our tendency in the West to try and constantly distinguish ourselves. So there's definitely variation at different times and places on that question.
So I wanted to pick up on that thread of twins and relationships with other people as well. And you write in really moving ways about your experience as children and your parents navigate. I'm sure there might be some parents of twins in the audience who it's a very common question to twins. How should you parent twins? You might like to answer that, but also about twins navigating relationships and the complexities with friendships, but then with further relationships as you grow up. And I wonder again whether you could kind of reflect on your own experiences and that of Julia, and what you've sort of observed and written about in the book there.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, there's this kind of binary treatment of twin relationships in many cultures. On the one hand, twins are seen as being a perfect relationship, right? They're incredibly close. They can trust each other completely. They have this constant companion. It's like a wonderful, in a way, romantic vision of twinhood. You're two halves of the same thing. So it's this very idealized picture. But then there's this other vision you see of twinhood in myth and art and popular culture and everyday life, where twinhood is this kind of dangerous pathological relationship. So a lot of stories about twins end in murder or suicide. They often represent characters who are somehow sort of immature. They refuse to take up their responsibilities. They're mentally ill. They're sick in various ways. Maybe they're evil. So there's, again, a sort of dark side of twin representations. So when I was writing the book, I was trying to get a grip on why that exists. Why is it that twinhood seems dangerous? And I think it is because twins are, in a way, I like to think of them as relationship outlaws. They're departing from a vision of the ideal adult relationship in a way that is kind of frightening or disturbing. So we think the ideal human relationship when you're an adult is meant to be a romantic sexual union, usually with someone of the opposite gender, where you're raising kids together and you're focusing your life on that one person, and it ideally lasts, into the distant future. And twins don't have that relationship when they're still close. They have platonic connection. They'll often spend a lot of time with each other as opposed to with their spouses. They might live next door to each other, co-raise their children. So they don't look like what adults are meant to be doing. And so I see this sort of pathological picture as being a way of trying to kind of send a message, right? That's not okay. Even if it ends rather dramatically in death, it's a way of trying to police the bounds of normative adult relations. And I think, yeah, twins have experienced that kind of pressure in their own lives. Many twins, they've felt that they need to sort of set their twin aside in order to focus on their romantic partner, or they're seen as, yeah, somehow unhealthy for not doing that.
And that sort of, I suppose it's really interesting to think about that from the perspective of the twin and letting other people into your life as your twin's partner or spouse, but also from that perspective of the spouse or partner stepping into a twin relationship. Again, we might have audience members who have bravely done that. It is a very interesting and distinctive relationship that extends, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I don't want to downplay the difficulties. I think, my overall view is that we ought to allow for multiple relationships in adulthood. It shouldn't just be one person that you're supposed to be directing all of your social energies towards. So I do think that's a healthy way to think about it. But, in practical terms on the ground, there are going to be tensions, right? It's hard to work out what role you should play in someone's life when they have this other person there who's been there from the beginning and is super close to them. And so jealousy and conflict definitely going to come up. And sometimes twins manage them well, and sometimes it's a very difficult stage. when romantic partners come onto the scene for many twins.
I suppose, yeah, one of the other things I thought was lovely about the book was that you're at a point in your life where you're reflecting back on those early teenage relationships and finding your way in the dating scene, and then your experiences through different kinds of relationships to where you find yourself now. And there's a real maturity and reflection back on almost wanting to be kind to your younger self and say it's okay to not know quite where you are right now. That's okay. But then that desperate desire, of course, of every teenager probably to want to find that path and the security that comes with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Julia and I both, I talk about this in the book, we both came out as queer in our mid-30s. She did first, and then a couple of years later, to my surprise, I did too. So we switched sexual orientations later in life. And part of that chapter talks about the parallels between being a twin and being queer. Obviously, there are many differences, but I think there are some interesting commonalities. I was talking before about the way that twins are often pathologized in stories, and you get the same thing about queer couples. Obviously, it's changing now, but it used to be the case that if you were a gay or lesbian character, at least one of you was going to be killed off, by the end of the the show or the book. So again, I think this is the parallel there, is that it's another type of non-normative relationship, and it looks similar to twins sometimes because you have people of the same gender, right, who are in this very close relationship. So often twins, it's implied that twins are somehow gay. There's a kind of a trope of identical twins, sleeping with each other, the female ones anyway. And then there's also the sense that gay couples are somehow twinny, they're with someone who's very similar to them. So there's an interesting parallel there. And again, I think it just helps to show just how narrow our standard understanding of healthy adult relationships is. We see something that moves outside the norm, and we tend to want to pathologize it.
Yeah, or feel threatened by it, or and not understand it.
Right. Yeah.
So that notion of the question you ask in the fourth chapter in the book, how free are you? That sort of the challenge to twins about, will you, that an assumption that it must be very limiting or concerning to rely on somebody else. And I think the other strand that you bring through in the book is also not just queer theory and the ways in which understanding twins speaks to that, but also your own experiences of bodily autonomy. You mentioned that wonderful example in the library, which really made me laugh out loud, but that you also, obviously there's the question of that physical similarity, but your own well-being and health, you've also experienced that being shared with your twin, and that's a way of both seeing difference but then also finding similarity there too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So my sister and I share this disability where we fracture our bones easily. So we have this structural issue in our bones. So growing up, we were weird because we were twins, and we were also weird because we were often on crutches and injured in various ways. So yeah, it was those were two really central features of our childhood. And as I started writing about twins, I found myself thinking about disability too. I don't want to sort of overemphasize the way that twins are a social minority. They're not oppressed in the same way that queer people or disabled people are. So they're not oppressed, but they are unusual. They're a minority in the population, so they're rare. They step outside the norm. And they have kind of unusual bodies. They're duplicated, right? Conjoined twins have very unusual bodies because they're actually physically attached, but even non-conjoined identical twins are anatomically unusual. So there's a sort of attention to your body and to your physical self that is very present from the beginning. I also think that's a similarity twins have with women, right? They're sort of hyper visible. Their physical surfaces are focused on at the expense of their inner lives. So these other sort of ways of being unusual, tracked in interesting ways, being a twin. So that's an ongoing theme of the book, really, what it is that we can learn about the connection between twinhood and these other types of non-normative ways of being a human.
Yes, you write, I mean, in very moving ways. And I was fascinated by the archival and historical research you've done as well about the conjoined twins that used to be part of traveling shows and entertainment, but also the insights we've gained from studies of conjoined twins. And obviously, twins as the sources of the physical bodies of twins, as the sources of experiment, Mengele and the horrific experiments that have been, twins have been that sort of, laboratory, I suppose, for nature versus nurture debates as well. Could you say a little bit more about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So twins are this kind of natural experiment. They're very useful in behavioral genetics if you're trying to work out what the relative impact of nature and nurture is on human behavior. And you hear about these, I'm sure some of the people in the audience will have heard about some of these very unusual cases of twins separated at birth who reunite and are found to be extraordinarily similar, right? They haven't spent any time together until, say, their mid-30s. But their lives are just very, very, very similar. So there's the Jim twins. They both married someone called Betty and divorced her, married someone called Linda. They named their kid the same, James Allen. They named their dog the same thing. They had the same vacations at the same beach in Florida. They never met each other, weirdly. They did woodworking in their garages. They were exactly 180 pounds. They bit their nails to the quick. It's just a really, and obviously their brainwave and personality tests came out identical when they were tested. So when people hear that kind of story, it tends to freak them out. They have a little bit of an existential crisis because they think, well, clearly what's explaining these similarities is genetics, which suggests that our DNA is really determinative and in our sense of self and who we are, how we act. So how much freedom of action do we really have if our DNA is driving it in that way? So twins become very quickly a philosophical question, not just a scientific question about how much free agency is really possible for humans. So people always raise that type of thing with twins. And what I talk about in the chapters, I've always been completely bored by it. I'm meant to be interested in it, and I'm just not, and which is odd for a philosophy professor because you'd think I would be super interested in free will. So I'm thinking in the book about why it is that I'm unmoved by it. And I had a couple of ideas. One is that, if you are an identical twin, you've seen from very early in your life just how much your biological inheritance has shaped you. You get used to it. It doesn't seem like a frightening thing. You're still living a flourishing life. It doesn't seem that important. But the other one, I think, is connected to what we were saying before. I think if you're close to your twin, you're less inclined to be frightened by the idea that things that you might think of sort of external to you, external forces of the environment or of your genes, if you want to see them as somehow separate from you, have formed who you are, because you're used to seeing yourself as being in dialogue with things outside you, and particularly your twin. So you don't have as much of a desire to somehow create yourself out of nothing as you might if you were a singleton.
And you talk about the work that has been done with conjoined twins, where notwithstanding sharing limbs, they are very distinct personalities. But also the notion or the suggestion that they should be separated can be incredibly traumatic for them.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, it's just once you've got two heads, a pair of conjoined twins with two heads, like the absolute norm is that they have very, very distinct personalities. So even in that case where you might think closeness is at the extreme, the human limit, you still have differentiation, which I think should be comforting to to some people. Not necessarily. I think it's a line in the movie Adaptation, where there are twin characters in that. They're very different characters. And one twin says, God, I feel so lonely. It's that we have exactly the same genes, and yet somehow I'm still completely different from you. So some people might find it not comforting, but yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that chapter in the book, I have to say, I felt like I wanted to join one of your philosophy classes when I was reading it, because you introduce in a very gentle way some quite complex ideas about compatibilist theory and the counterfactual self. So they're quite complex, but I'm sure for every philosophy graduate, really, really important. But you lead us gently through that, through the lens of your own experience in those debates. And I felt like I'd learned a lot from the chapter about philosophy, as well as being a twin.
Oh, that's good to hear. Yeah, I think part of the aim of the book is to make philosophy feel more fun and accessible than it often does to many people. So
Yeah,
that's nice
well,
to hear.
definitely job done on that. So as in the last few minutes of our conversation, I just wanted to move to that sort of rather joyous final chapter, Helena, where you sort of go back to that early self, and you're admiring somebody else for being very kind of bold, or and having this social power, and then you reminisce about the social power that you and Julia had when you were younger as the twins, and I absolutely felt myself nodding along with that chapter. So can you tell us a little bit about that reflection?
Yeah, I think that many twins, again, I think probably many identical twins, have this sense of being mini celebrities when they're growing up, because twins are just fascinating. I mean, I feel it too. I am a twin, and I'm still completely transfixed when I see a pair of identical twins walking past. So you are this special person or pair of people wherever you go. And twins learn to use that. It's a resource that they have. So sometimes it's annoying to be constantly stared at. Obviously, it has its downsides, but you can also generate a sense of empowerment out of it and have some fun with it. You're playing with singletons, expectations and desires and fears in relation to twinhood. So my sister and I definitely did a lot of that growing up. We hammed it up for our own purposes. And yeah, it's nice to remember. I think in general, you can think that about, again, the sort of social minorities in general. You feel different, that can be bad, but also you can use it in interesting ways. So I think there's a positive side. In the chapter, I also talk about the ways that twins get used by singletons in less beneficial ways. And talk about the idea of objectification, like twins are often treated as sort of instrumentalized or seen as, again, being more important for their physical, superficial features than their inner lives. And this ethical question about whether or not twins should be participating in that, whether it's a bad idea to kind of lean into those kinds of stereotypes about yourself. So that question connects with some issues in feminism about how women are objectified and also participate in their own self-objectification. So there's a connection there too.
And you obviously we started by thinking about yourself and Julia. You're both academics. That's also the same for myself and my twin. But I wondered if you might reflect on how difficult or different that might have been. I mean, I wonder whether you feel that your own experience is a product of you both treading the same path, and that little bit of competitive edge, but also supporting each other intellectually and then treading a very similar path, and whether that might be very different if perhaps twins have very different intellectual abilities or interests or achievements, and that might bring with it different opportunities but also challenges as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. Looking back, I feel that my sister and I, we didn't want to be better than each other academically. That was sort of our area of strength. We were nerds. We didn't want to be better than each other, but we also did not want to be worse than each other. So I think there was a kind of almost an unconscious mutual adjustment where I would be getting a little further ahead in some class or other at university, and then Julie would try and catch up, and maybe I would slow down. I try to work this out, because at the end of our high school years, we did the national exams that New Zealand has, and we got exactly the same percentage grade across all the subjects. There were 6 subjects, and we all got, we got 592 out of 600 or something. It was ridiculous how exactly on point we were. So I think in our case, we really wanted to make sure that we didn't lag behind, but we didn't want to dominate. So we were lucky we managed to pull that off, I think, relationally, because it didn't cause a lot of tension. But there are certainly cases where one twin is just, significantly better at some endeavor than the other. And if it's something that they both care about, it can cause a lot of tension. I have a student who's dealing with that at the moment with her identical twin. So I think this is one of the reasons twins sometimes move into distinct fields, right? They're trying to establish a division of labor such that their relationship isn't at risk. But at the same time, as with you and me, twins will often end up getting into exactly the same field because they just have similar interests. So it's that's another area of risk. I think we talked earlier about romantic relationships in twinhood, careers in twinhood. There's so many eyes on you, even if you're not feeling envious or insecure, everyone assumes that you will be, and you have to manage that kind of reaction from others.
Yes, and that constant comparison, whether
Yeah,
in all areas of life,
yeah.
um, goes with you, I suppose. Yes, and has to be navigated by yourselves as well as others outside your relationships as well. Really, really profound. So I just wanted to finish really by asking you, Helena, what's kind of next for you? I mean, obviously this book is kind of opening up both really interesting philosophical territory, but do you have another book that's in the pipeline that is brewing from this, or are you continuing to study this theme?
Yeah, I am writing another book now. It's in terms of genre, it's similar to this one. It's a mix of philosophical theory and personal narrative. So it's about the question of meaning in life, how it is that we live a meaningful life, with one chapter on each of a bunch of different answers to that question, told through different episodes in my own life. So genre-wise, it's similar. I really enjoy writing these hybrid theory and memoir books. I don't know if Julia will be in it. Probably she will be. I tried to cabin her and put her in this book, but she's obviously such a huge part of my life that she crops up everywhere. So there may be a little bit more of Julia in this next book. We'll see.
Oh, I think I thought her illustrations, that's enough, you know, it's obviously a distinct talent that she has, but they brought your points to life so vividly as well. So I think people will love the illustrations as well within the book. So we're going to move now to our audience Q&As, and I'm just going to open up our questions from our audience. So our first question comes from Claire Gilding, and she suggests that with identical twins sharing genetics, it brings an additional element to that sort of shared environment, the nurture debate as well. And that does make us more similar, which sort of suggests to me, Claire, that you might be a twin as well. So I guess that's Helene, that's one of those sort of nature nurture debates that you return to time and time again in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I was talking earlier about how we can often be freaked out by twins who are very similar, who've been separated at birth, because that suggests that genes are really doing a lot of work. We can also be troubled by twins whose lives turn out very differently, because in that case, I think we're focusing on the possibility that totally random and circumstantial factors can throw you off course, right? You've got the same genetic inheritance, but somehow one of you is doing this thing and one's doing a totally different thing. That also seems to kind of put our freedom of action into question. Right? We like to think we're directing our own lives, and then suddenly random things happen. It's not us who's directing them. So whichever of those directions you take on the nature-nurture question, you end up having these existential worries, I think.
Yeah. So second question is about one of our audience members who has a daughter who's friends with identical twins. They both lost the same first tooth in the same position on the same day, and that blows her mind. And she wonders whether that's something twins often experience. I mean, you talked about your own experience of health conditions, Helena. I don't know whether you lost your teeth at the same time or... Yeah.
You'd have to check in with my mother about that. Yeah. We certainly have done many things in very, if not at the same time, in close succession. It's very entertaining when that happens. We would also, once we went out to town, it was Easter, I think we wanted to buy each other an Easter present, and we went all the way around town individually looking for things, came home and we'd bought exactly the same thing out of a whole range of, there's definitely a lot of, you might call them coincidences, or you might get a little bit more mystical about it. There is constant synchronicity in the twin relationship throughout life. I feel like I have less of it now that I'm living in a different country, but certainly growing up, there are a lot of entertaining moments of that kind.
Well, there's another question that is in the chat, which is again from one of our audience members, reflecting on some twins who at primary and secondary school dressed exactly the same, walked in step, had mopeds with just 1-digit difference. And the question is, do we think that that's likely to be because of the way that they were parented? And is this intensity common? Interesting
Yeah,
question.
good questions. Yeah, it's hard to know whether it was parenting or not that did it. I think some parents are very committed to treating their twins as individuals and encouraging them to separate, but it doesn't always work, right? I think the twin relationship is just so essential in itself that parents sometimes don't have very much of a, ability to adjust it. My mother said that she often felt like she was sort of excluded from our childhood in the first few years because we were so focused on each other. She tried to push us in one direction or another, we wouldn't have noticed, So I don't know if it's parenting that does it. Um, some twins really do want to continue to have very visible closeness and similarity right the way through their adulthood. Like there's actually I heard about a cosmetic surgeon, a plastic surgeon in Manhattan, whose whole practice is about retwinning identical twins who have started to look less similar as they age. Which is wild. And certainly dressing together, there's that famous festival, the Twins Festival in Ohio that happens every year where twins turn up, wear the same outfits and really lean into that aspect of their relationship. So I'm not sure how common it is. There's definitely social pressure against doing it, but you see it out there. And again, I think, if twins want to do it, I don't really see there being anything deeply problematic about it.
I think my mother's reflection was that at least we took it in turns to be bad every other day.
I like it. Too evil.
So this is from a parent of twins, and I think that we might, that advice, tell me how to be the parent of twins, which maybe twins are not the best people to give advice about being parents. I was parented by a twin as well as being a twin, so that was a bit interesting experience. But this question is reflecting on an experience of teenagers, fraternal, it sounds like, twins who found that experience quite difficult to navigate because you're judged by what your twin looks like as well as how you're behaving or how you look and act yourself, and that can lead to some social anxiety. And it's a question really, is that how common is that with twins?
Yeah. I do think people just feel they have license to point out, personal features of twins in circumstances where they never would if it was singletons, right? You'd just be walking down the street and some complete stranger will come up and say, oh, let me work out what the difference is. Oh, you're a little fatter than her, or like you have this weird thing on your nose. You wouldn't dream of doing that to a complete stranger, but twins are seen as somehow kind of public property. So that habit is present there from the beginning. I don't know, I don't remember being too troubled by it myself with my sister, but I think it's because there were not any great differences between us physically until we moved into our teens. I mean, late teens. But I know it is really, it's a real problem. And so one thing I'm trying to do in the book is give singletons a little bit of advice about etiquette, right? In relation to twins. Don't do that, just don't do it. I don't think it's healthy. It's not helpful for anyone. A little bit of reflection on what it would be like to be at the receiving end of that treatment would be helpful. It's already twins are dealing with a whole lot of attention, and that kind of attention does not seem to be useful.
Yeah, I think, and I suppose in teenage years, it's very common for other teenagers to want to project their own anxieties onto twins, and therefore differences and similarities. Most people, want to fit in, but then find themselves being the minor differences are exaggerated. So perhaps that's also a very interesting experience of being a teenager anyway, and being compared or comparing yourself with others, and that is magnified when you're a twin.
I think people are doing so much projection on twins, right? They'll come across a pair and they'll think, oh, which twin am I most like? And they'll identify with one as opposed to the other, which involves a lot of their own, needs and interests being thrown upon that person. So there's a lot of kind of creative interpretation of individual twins' personalities for the purposes of singletons rather than twins.
Yeah. So just returning to our questions, we've got a reflection from a parent of girl and boy twins, and that reflection on actually, that I suppose it's one thing that we should say, the work of our mothers in producing these amazing two entities from them. But I suppose it is much more common now to have twins and multiples in society, and sort of share those experiences, and how helpful that can be to see that many multiples experience challenges as well as just this kind of joy of being together, that it's not as easy or isolating perhaps as it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think the twin rate has roughly doubled since 1980 for a couple of reasons. One is the rise of assisted reproductive technology, and the other is the rise in the average age of pregnancy. So once you hit 35, you're much more likely to have non-identical twins because you're ovulating more. We have many more twins on the planet than we used to. Not more identical twins. There's like a little bit of an increase in identical twinning, but definitely in non-identical twinning. So it's not as unusual to be a twin these days, and I think that's been helpful. It's raised awareness about twinhood across the board, and maybe less than some of the stereotypes that people have about what it means to be a twin.
Yeah, I guess one of those interesting questions, again, you reflect on it in the book, is the experience of motherhood yourself. Helena, your sister having children, you not. I'm in a similar position myself. That there's something very interesting about going through one twin going through an experience that the other doesn't, and that's an interesting reflection again.
Yeah, I think Julia was nervous about telling me that she wanted to have a baby and then that she was pregnant, because it was obviously a brand new type of relationship that was going to affect our own relationship in a fundamental way. And she wasn't sure how I would feel about it. And I think I felt a little odd about it. When I met my niece when she was born, we were very close instantly. She sort of reached out her arms and hugged me at the airport, at a very young age. So I had a really nice connection with my niece, which helped. But yeah, there are a lot of things about, about Julia's life over the past 10 years that I can't directly relate to it by virtue of not being a parent. So yeah, I think it's an important difference between us now. I think I've tried my best to be a good aunt and participate in the ways that I can.
Yeah, I think it is again, it's a different kind of a very special relationship that you can create as a twin aunt or uncle, I'm sure. There's a couple of other questions in the chat. From Karen, is the sense of selfhood or experience of twinhood similar or very different for identical and non-identical twins in your experience of researching the book, Helena?
Yeah. You can't fully generalize because there will be exceptions. There'll be some identical twins who function more as non-identical twins and vice versa. But it is the case that identical twins tend to be closer than non-identical twins. That's definitely been shown. So it's hard to know whether, how much of that is just sort of intrinsic to the experience and how much is due to social pressures. I'm not really sure if any research has been done on that or whether it would be like empirically tractable in that way. But yeah, who you are, how you understand your own self-image and how you understand your relationship is going to be affected by all the views that other people are projecting onto you. So I think we tend to assume that identical twins should be and will be closer. So maybe that's what's going on there.
And when they're not, the consequences for that are perhaps also quite serious and difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people don't want twins to be too close late in life. We talked about that, but there also is this expectation that identical twins should be in touch with each other and loving towards each other. And if you don't have that in your own twinship, you can feel that you've failed. You're a bad twin, or you can feel a sense of loss and grief. Estranged twins often like very bereft and embarrassed and feel guilt about that fact.
Actually, there's a very moving reflection, Helena, you have about something probably twins who are close don't really want to think about, which is what is going to happen when you're left behind by your twin and they're no longer there. And that's a really interesting philosophical reflection, which I guess one can't know, but from your research that is a very difficult and challenging experience.
Yeah, there was, I mentioned that I heard about that twin conference where they had panels on a whole bunch of different things related to twinhood. Twins were all over the conference center having a great time, but there was this one panel on what to do, the experience of surviving your twin's death. And apparently no one turned up. It was just an experience that a twin just cannot handle thinking about. It's just you've had this person around from the very beginning. You used to be the same thing if you're an identical twin, or you were in the womb at the same time if you're non-identical. You can't imagine your life without that person. So yeah, I mean, I think if you have a very, very strong sense of closeness, one would hope that that when one twin goes, you continue to feel a connection to them. But apparently, you can measure grief on what's known as the grief experience inventory, and twins just, they're at the top of that list. It's the most intense experience of grief that has been recorded. So yeah, I don't think you can be a twin and not think about that, especially as you get older.
Yeah. Summer, who's on the chat, was reflecting that they and their twin didn't lose teeth on the same day, but within a couple of months. So I think that still counts as pretty in tune with each other. Summer, very definitely. There's a fun question here about whether either of us were dressed identically as children.
What about you? What did your parents do?
We were a bit of a surprise. In my generation, scans were not common, so my mother was not expecting twins. So my grandmother had only knitted, a good Lancashire grandmother had only knitted one set of everything. So there was a furious knitting going on. Initially, yes, but my twin and I, this resonated with your first chapter. My twin was a real tomboy all the way through childhood, and I was very girly. So pretty quickly, we distinguished ourselves by our dress. And so, yeah, and when Mel was made to wear a dress for parties and formal events, it was not a happy time for her.
My mother is English, so we would have all these English outfits sent to us from down to New Zealand. They'd arrive at Christmas, they were matching, and we would have a photo shoot in the backyard where we wore the matching outfits, and then we would never wear the matching outfits again. We'd mix it up. So we do have a lot of family photos where we're wearing. Julia would be always, for some reason, get the blue outfit, and I would get the pink one. There was like some weird kind of gendered division. She had some resentment about that at the time. She didn't want to be the blue twin.
Well, we had yes, definitely. We at secondary school we were asked to wear different coloured shoes so that the teachers would just have a quick look under the table and see which twin was which. Right, we have one final question, I think, in the chat from Etta, and that's a reflection that there were fewer twins historically due to the difficulties of multiple births. So twins would have been even more unusual and therefore very noticeable historically.
Yeah, I do think, I mean, people always wonder, what is it that's so fascinating about twins? And there are so many answers to that question. Some of them are these deep philosophical questions that twins raise. But another reason is just the rarity of twins. There's only identical twins. It's 3 in 1,000 births as a result in identical twins. So I think, we have more twins around now. But back in the day, it was really quite unusual. And part of what's fascinating about twins is they seem to sort of step outside the natural order. So a lot of myths about twins are about, breaks in the natural order of things. And that comes with these sort of sense that twins are somehow sinister, or that they have magical powers, just because they don't seem to fit in with the standard human form.
But they're a great plot device as well. You talk about Shakespeare's love of twins and actually the work they can do within fiction or literature or art, or they are a very useful device for creativity as well.
We have done a lot for art. We have definitely been a very useful narrative resource over the centuries.
Okay, I'm going to end with a really moving comment from Janet, who's reflecting, following on our past exchange, that she's a lone twin now, and it's a really complex grief. But absolutely, as you just reflected, Helena, that you still feel the connection of your twin, Janet. That's amazing. And Janet's directing people towards the Lone Twin Network, which sounds like the most amazing resource and lifesaver. Thank you so much, Janet. That might really resonate with some people. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. So we're coming to the end of our Q&A, and Helena, I just want to say thank you so much for your participation this evening and for the book itself. So I'm just going to remind our audience that a recording of this event will be available on the Festival of Ideas YouTube channel, and that can be accessed from the Watch Again function. So you will be sent an email if you've been attending, if you want to watch again or recommend it to friends. And then finally, I just wanted to say that if you would like to buy a copy of Helena's book, you can buy it now. It is available through the Festival of Ideas partner site, Fox Lane Books. So do check that out, and I warmly recommend it for singletons and for twins. It's a really great read, and as I mentioned, a gateway into some fantastic philosophy too. So Helena, thank you so much for your time this evening. It's been great to talk to you.